That was not just a title. That was a door. And behind that door, there was a world that most people have never seen, never imagined, and never stopped to think about. A world where the smell of fresh-cut oak filled the morning air, where the sound of a mallet striking a chisel echoed through narrow streets, where a man's hands told the story of his entire life before he ever spoke a single word. This is the story of that world, and this is the story of one man who lived inside it. His name was Thomas Aldwych, a carpenter by trade, by blood, and by destiny. Born in the village of Ashford, tucked into the rolling green hills of Kent, England, in the year of our Lord 1347. A year that the world would remember not for its beauty, but for its terror. But Thomas did not know that yet. He was only a boy when the world he knew was still whole, still breathing, still full of the ordinary magic that only the very young can see in simple things. The house where Thomas was born was not grand. It was never meant to be. It was a single-room structure built from timber frames, the spaces between the wooden beams filled with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal hair, a technique the villagers called wattle and daub. The roof above him was thatched, a thick blanket of dried reeds woven together by his grandfather's hands decades before Thomas drew his first breath. The floor beneath his bare feet was packed earth, smoothed by years of footsteps, sometimes covered with rushes that his mother gathered from the edge of the river. There was one central hearth. No chimney in those early years, only a hole cut into the roof above the fire, which let out some of the smoke and let in most of the wind. The walls were perpetually darkened by soot. The air inside the house always carried the faint scent of burning wood and something earthier, something alive. Animals were sometimes kept at one end of the dwelling during the harshest winter months: a cow, 2 pigs, a handful of chickens. Their warmth was not a luxury, it was survival. Thomas grew up understanding one thing before he understood anything else. The house was not separate from the land, the house was made from the land. The timber came from the forest at the edge of the village. The clay came from the riverbank. The reeds came from the marsh. The stone used to weigh down the thatch came from the hillside. Every part of the home was a piece of the earth rearranged by human hands, and those hands were almost always the hands of a carpenter. His father, Edmund Aldwych, was the finest carpenter in Ashford. Everyone said so, and they said it without jealousy, because in a village like that, a skilled carpenter was not competition. He was a necessity. Edmund built beds and benches, tables and storage chests, door frames and window shutters, roof trusses and floorboards. He repaired the mill wheel when it cracked. He built the coffins when the old ones passed. He constructed the cradles that held the new ones when they arrived. His hands touched nearly every significant moment in a villager's life, and he did it all with a quiet pride that Thomas absorbed the way dry wood absorbs rain. The workshop was attached to the side of the house, a lean-to structure with an open front that faced south to catch the light. Edmund worked from first light until last light, because candles and rushlights were expensive and the sun was free. Inside the workshop, the tools hung on pegs along the wall: the broad axe for rough shaping, the adze for smoothing large surfaces, the draw knife for shaping chair legs and tool handles, the mortise chisel for cutting joints, the brace and bit for drilling, the wooden mallet, the marking gauge, the tri-square. Each tool had a place, and each place was sacred in its own way. Thomas began working beside his father at the age of 7. Not with the sharp tools, not yet. He swept the shavings from the floor. He fetched water from the well. He held pieces of wood steady while his father worked. He watched. He listened. He asked questions, and his father answered them with patience that never seemed to run out, explaining not just what he was doing, but why. Why the grain of the wood mattered. Why a joint cut against the grain would fail under pressure. Why green wood split differently than seasoned wood. Why the heartwood of an oak was stronger than the sapwood. Why a craftsman always worked with the material and never against it. By the time Thomas was 10, he was making simple things on his own: wooden spoons, pegs, small tool handles. His father watched him work without interfering, only offering a word of correction when the boy was about to make a mistake that would ruin the piece entirely. By 12, Thomas was assisting on real jobs, helping to raise a new roof beam in a neighbor's house, cutting the simple mortise joints in a storage bench ordered by the parish priest. By 14, he had already developed the particular unhurried way of moving his hands that marked a craftsman who knew what he was doing. The village itself was a world contained. Ashford sat at the center of a web of fields, forests, and footpaths that connected it to the surrounding farmsteads and to the market town 6 miles to the east. The village green was the heart of everything, the place where announcements were made, disputes were settled, celebrations were held, and gossip was exchanged with the efficiency of a well-run postal service. Around the green stood the church, the inn, the blacksmith's forge, the mill, and a cluster of homes belonging to the freeholders and craftsmen who formed the backbone of village life. The rhythm of the year was governed not by clocks but by seasons, festivals, and the demands of the land. Spring meant planting, and even a carpenter's family maintained a small strip of land in the open field system that divided the farmable ground around the village. Edmund and Thomas worked those strips alongside everyone else during the planting weeks because no one in a medieval village could afford to be purely one thing. A carpenter was also a farmer when the soil needed turning. A farmer was also a builder when a wall needed fixing. Everyone did everything, and the community survived because its members understood that their individual survival depended entirely on the health of the whole. Summer was the season of long days and heavy work. It was the season when timber was felled because the sap was low and the wood would season more slowly, making it stronger and more resistant to warping. Edmund taught Thomas how to select a tree, how to look at the bark, how to judge the straightness of the grain, how to estimate how many usable pieces a single trunk would yield. They walked the forest together in those early morning hours before the heat of the day came down, and Edmund talked in the low, steady voice he reserved for things that mattered, pointing out which oaks were ready and which needed another 10 years, explaining how the direction a tree leaned told you something about the stresses it had been living under, and how that mattered when you were going to ask it to hold up a roof. Autumn brought the harvest, and the entire village moved into the fields as one organism, cutting and gathering with an intensity driven by the knowledge that what they collected in those few short weeks would determine whether they ate through the winter or went hungry. After the harvest came the slaughtering of animals that could not be fed through the cold months, the salting and smoking and drying that turned fresh meat into preserved stores that would last until spring. The workshop slowed during these weeks because every hand was needed elsewhere. Winter was when the carpenter's shop came fully alive again. With the fields at rest and the days short, men returned to their crafts, and orders that had been placed in summer were finally worked through. Thomas loved winter evenings in the workshop, the single candle casting long shadows across the shavings on the floor, the smell of beeswax and linseed oil and fresh oak. His father working at one end of the bench and him at the other, the two of them talking or not talking, the silence between them as comfortable as any words. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because this story is just beginning, and what Thomas is about to face will change everything you think you know about the strength it takes to build a life with your bare hands. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single chapter of this journey. Thomas was 17 when his father collapsed in the workshop. It happened without warning. Edmund had been working on a commission for a wealthy merchant in the market town. A carved oak chest, the most ambitious piece he had ever undertaken, with linen fold panels on the front and decorative iron hardware that the blacksmith was making to Edmund's specifications. The chest was nearly finished. Edmund was fitting the last panel into its frame when he simply sat down on the floor, his back against the workbench, his face the color of old ash. Thomas was beside him in an instant. He did not know what to do, so he did what he had seen his mother do in moments of crisis. He kept his hands moving, kept talking, kept his own fear packed tightly below the surface where it could not do any damage. He brought water. He covered his father with his own coat. He sent the neighbor boy running for the healer who lived at the edge of the village near the mill. Edmund recovered after a fashion. He was never quite the same after that morning. His left hand trembled slightly when he tried to do fine work. He tired more easily. He could no longer lift the heavy timbers alone and had to rely on Thomas for the physical work that had once been effortless for him. He did not speak about any of this directly. He simply began doing it differently, shifting the division of labor between them without announcement or explanation, the way practical men handle the things they cannot change. Thomas understood. He did not offer sympathy that would embarrass his father. He stepped into the gap without being asked, taking on more of the heavy work, handling more of the client conversations, doing more of the estimating and planning that he had previously only observed. And something unexpected happened in that transition. Thomas discovered that he was good at it. Not just competent, not just adequate, but genuinely intuitively good at reading a piece of wood and understanding what it wanted to become, good at talking with clients and understanding what they actually needed, as opposed to what they thought they needed. Good at the creative problem-solving that was, at its core, what craftsmanship really was. By the time Thomas was 19, he was doing most of the work. By 20, he was the carpenter of Ashford in all but name, with his father serving as the elder voice of experience that corrected his occasional errors of judgment and reminded him of principles he had not yet had the experience to discover on his own. It was a good arrangement. It was, in many ways, the arrangement that every craftsman hoped for, to be succeeded by a child who surpassed him, to have built something that outlasted the span of his own hands. But the world outside Ashford was not interested in good arrangements. The summer that Thomas turned 21, a traveler came through the village on his way from the coast. He stopped at the inn for water and bread, and he brought news with him the way travelers always did, casually the way you might mention the weather, as if the weight of what he was saying had not yet fully settled onto him. He said that ships from the continent had arrived at several ports. He said that sailors from those ships were becoming very ill. He said that in some towns, the people were dying faster than they could be buried. Thomas heard this secondhand from the innkeeper's wife, who had it from the miller, who had been at the inn when the traveler spoke. He listened with the detached curiosity of someone to whom the news felt like a story about somewhere else, about other people, in another reality entirely. He thanked her for telling him and went back to the workshop, where a client was waiting to discuss a new commission. He did not think about it again for 3 weeks. Then the news came again, closer. A village 4 miles east, a family in the market town, then another family. Then the road between the market town and Ashford went quiet in a way roads should not go quiet during the busiest season of the trading year. When it reached Ashford, it did not come like a story. It came like winter, not as a single moment, but as a gradual, undeniable weight settling onto the world. One morning there were 3 households that did not come out when the sun rose. By the following week, there were 9. Thomas watched his village change in ways he did not have words for. The green, which had always been the most alive place he knew, became a place people crossed quickly, avoiding each other's eyes. The church, which had always offered a kind of comfort regardless of one's private doubts, became a place people were afraid to enter because illness had reached even there. The familiar patterns of daily life, the greeting at the well, the exchange of news outside the forge, the children playing their shouting games along the lane. All of it was interrupted by something for which the village had no rehearsal. Edmund survived. Thomas survived. His mother survived. But the world they survived into was not the same one they had lived in before. The population of Ashford, which had been perhaps 240 souls when Thomas was born, was reduced by nearly a third in the span of a single terrible season. Houses stood empty. Workshops fell silent. Fields that had been carefully tended for generations were left unworked, the strips reverting to weeds and wildflowers, as if the land were quietly reclaiming what had always been its own. And here, leave your comment below. Tell me, if you had been Thomas, standing at the edge of that empty field, looking at a village that had lost a third of its people, what would you have done? Would you have stayed? Or would you have done what Thomas did? Because Thomas did something unexpected. He stayed, and he built. Not because he was not afraid, he was afraid. He was afraid every morning when he woke up and took his own measure, checking for the signs that the healer had described, pressing his fingers against his own neck and feeling his own pulse with a relief that bordered on guilt when he found it steady. He was afraid for his father, whose weakened condition seemed to invite every misfortune. He was afraid in the way that people who have watched others suffer are always afraid, with a precise, specific personal knowledge of exactly what can go wrong. But he also understood something that his father had taught him without ever stating it directly, the way the most important lessons are always transmitted. A house does not build itself. A community does not maintain itself. The physical structures that people inhabit, the tables they eat at and the beds they sleep in and the roofs that keep the rain from their heads, all of it requires constant human effort to exist. The moment that effort stops, the structures begin to fail. The timbers rot. The thatch collapses. The joints work loose under the pressure of weather and use. Thomas became, in the years after the pestilence passed through Ashford, the person who held the physical world of the village together. He repaired what had fallen into disrepair during the terrible season. He worked on houses that had stood empty, stabilizing them against further collapse, making them habitable again for the families and individuals who began to arrive in Ashford as survivors from other decimated communities drifted through the countryside looking for somewhere to start again. He built new pieces for households that had lost everything. He negotiated his prices with the flexibility of someone who understood that the economy of his village was in the process of reinventing itself, that the old arrangements no longer applied in the same way, that the survivors had both more power and more vulnerability than they had possessed before. It was during this period that Thomas met Margaret. She had come to Ashford with her brother William, a tanner, who had heard that there was work available and property to be had at favorable terms in a village that needed new residents. William was a practical man, quiet and capable, and he established his tanning operation outside the village boundaries, as tanners always did, because the process produced smells that the community preferred to keep at a distance, with an efficiency that earned him a reputation before he had been in Ashford for 3 months. Margaret was different from her brother in almost every way. Where William was contained and methodical, Margaret was direct and openly curious, asking questions about the village and its history with an unself-conscious interest that Thomas found startling at first and then, quickly, delightful. She asked him about the workshop when she first came to commission a storage chest for William's new house, asked him about the tools, about the wood, about where the timber came from, and how he decided which pieces were suitable for which purposes. She looked at the half-finished pieces on his workbench with genuine interest, not the polite pretense of interest that most clients offered. He showed her things he had never shown anyone who was not learning the trade. The beauty of a particularly well-figured piece of oak, the way the light moved across the grain in a board that had been freshly planed, the joinery in a chest that would hold together for 100 years because of the way the wood was oriented and the joint was cut. She looked at all of it carefully, asked more questions, and when she finally told him what she wanted and they agreed on a price, she thanked him with the directness of someone who meant it without performance. He finished her chest in 2 weeks, which was faster than usual. He told himself this was because the commission was straightforward. He knew this was not the complete truth. The years that followed were the years of Thomas's full maturity as a craftsman and as a man. He and Margaret married when he was 23, in the church whose pews he had helped to repair after the pestilence years, in a ceremony conducted by a young priest who had come to replace the old one, whose passing had been among the most disorienting losses the village had experienced. The loss not just of a person, but of an institutional continuity that had seemed, until suddenly it didn't, as permanent as the stone of the church walls themselves. They built onto the family house. Thomas designed and built the addition himself, a proper second room with a plank floor instead of packed earth, a real chimney that drew the smoke properly up and out instead of letting it collect under the thatch, shuttered windows that could let in light without letting in the full force of the wind. Edmund watched the construction with visible pride, offering occasional observations that were, as always, delivered in the form of questions that led Thomas to discover the answers himself rather than simply providing them. Craftsman that he was becoming, Thomas was also beginning to understand something about his work that went beyond the technical. He was beginning to understand that a well-made object was not just useful, it was a form of communication. A chest that would hold together for a century was a message to the future, a declaration that the person who made it had cared enough to do it properly, had taken the time to understand the material and honor it by doing it justice. A house built well was a gift to everyone who would ever live inside it, including people not yet born who would inhabit it generations later with no knowledge of the hands that had shaped their shelter. His reputation spread beyond Ashford. This was partly a consequence of the changed world. The movement of people following the pestilence years had created new connections between communities that had previously been more isolated, and Thomas's quality of work traveled as a story through those networks the way all reliable information traveled, person to person, gradually, but with the accumulating weight of repeated testimony. He received a commission from a wool merchant in the market town, then from a minor landowner in the hills to the north, then, most significantly, from the building works of a cathedral that was undertaking a major addition to its nave and needed skilled woodworkers for the interior fittings. That cathedral commission changed everything. Thomas had always known in the abstract that beyond the world of village carpentry, there existed another scale of the craft entirely. The great carpentry of cathedrals and castles and guild halls and manor houses, the carpentry of roof bosses carved into foliate heads and angels, of choir stalls with their misericords, of hammer beam roofs that seemed to float above the nave by virtue of pure geometric intelligence, defying the weight of their own materials through the precision of their engineering. He had heard his father speak of such work with the particular reverence that craftsmen reserve for things that represent the outer boundary of what is possible in their trade. Now he was going to do it. The master carpenter of the cathedral works was a man named Geoffrey of Winchester, who had been working on ecclesiastical buildings for 30 years and had the manner, simultaneously patient and exacting, of someone who had learned to measure everything twice and regret nothing. He assessed Thomas's work samples without expression, asked him several technical questions about joinery methods and timber selection, and offered him a position as a senior member of the workshop crew in a tone that suggested he was doing Thomas a favor, while also obviously doing himself one. Thomas accepted. He traveled to the cathedral city, his first experience of a genuinely urban environment, a world entirely different from Ashford or the market town in ways that went far beyond mere scale. The city was overwhelming in its complexity and its noise, its smells and its movement, its layers of social hierarchy expressed in architecture and clothing and the precise geography of who lived where. The cathedral itself dominated everything, not just physically, though its physical dominance was absolute, its towers visible from 15 miles away on a clear day, but psychically, as the organizing principle around which the city had arranged itself over centuries, the reason for its existence, the source of its economic life, the center of its calendar, the backdrop against which every other human activity was conducted. The workshop was larger than anything Thomas had worked in before, a long, timber-framed building adjacent to the north transept, equipped with every tool he had ever used and several he had never seen, staffed by a dozen craftsmen of varying skills and specializations. The work being done was the fitting of a new set of choir stalls, and Thomas was assigned to the team responsible for the carved bench ends, which were to be decorated with a series of figures in a naturalistic style that the master carpenter had designed in detailed drawings pinned to a board at the end of the workshop. He worked on those choir stalls for 4 years. It was the education he had not known he was missing. Working alongside craftsmen who had spent decades developing specialized skills, he learned things that the general practice of village carpentry had not prepared him for. The techniques of high-relief carving, the way to use a range of chisels and gouges to create depth and movement in a flat surface. The geometric principles underlying the tracery work that decorated the canopies above the stalls. The way Gothic architecture used repetition and variation together in proportions that created a sense of organic order rather than mechanical repetition. He also learned about the social organization of craft at scale, the complex hierarchy of masters, journeymen, and apprentices, the guild structures that governed who could do what work and under what conditions, the economics of large building projects with their shifting labor requirements, their seasonal rhythms, their political complications as patrons changed their minds, or the money ran short or competing priorities intervened. He learned about the city itself. He walked its streets in the evenings after the workshop closed, exploring districts that had nothing to do with the building trades, the cloth merchants' quarter, the area near the river where the tanners and fullers worked, and he thought of William and smiled. The market that operated 3 days a week in the central square with its noise and its color and its bewildering variety of goods from places he had never been. He ate food he had never tasted. He heard music being played in public spaces in ways he had never encountered. He listened to arguments about theology conducted with passion and technical precision by men in robes who seemed to believe that the fate of the world depended on the correct resolution of questions he had never previously thought to ask. But he also missed Ashford. He missed the simplicity of knowing everyone he encountered, the comfort of a community small enough to be fully understood. He missed Margaret, who had remained in Ashford with their children, a daughter, Eleanor, born the year before he left, and a son, Richard, who arrived during his second year at the cathedral and whom he met for the first time when the boy was 4 months old and already smiling. He made the journey back when the season allowed it, every 3 or 4 months, and each return was both a reunion and a reminder of what the city was costing him in terms of the ordinary life he had left behind. The choir stalls were completed. They were magnificent. Geoffrey of Winchester stood before them on the day of their installation with an expression Thomas had never seen on his face before, an expression that mixed exhaustion and pride in a ratio that told you something essential about what it meant to bring a great project to its conclusion. He put his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder and said one sentence. "Good work." That was all. It was more than enough. Thomas returned to Ashford a changed man. Not changed in his values or his fundamental commitments, those had held steady through all of it, but expanded in his understanding of what his craft could be and what he was capable of within it. He came back with techniques, with contacts, with a reputation that now extended far beyond the village and the market town. He came back with the ability to take on work that would have been beyond him before, and with the discernment to know which work was worth taking. He also came back with something he had not anticipated bringing home, a clear sense of what he wanted his life to actually look like. And what he wanted it to look like was this. Not the cathedral workshop, which had been extraordinary but which was not his, not the city, which had been illuminating but which was not his. But this. The workshop attached to the house in Ashford. The bench where his father had stood for 40 years and where he himself had stood for 20. The tools on their pegs. The smell of oak and elm and ash. The familiar weight of the mallet in his hand. The particular satisfaction of a joint cut cleanly and assembled precisely, a drawer that slid without effort, a chair that was both beautiful and perfectly useful in the way that only a thing made with full attention to both beauty and usefulness can be. He expanded the workshop when he came back. He hired 2 apprentices from the village, boys of 12 and 13, whose fathers had spoken to him about the trade, asking if he would take them on. He established a proper training program, conscious of what his own apprenticeship had given him, and wanting to give the same thing to these young men. Not just technique, but the underlying principles, the habit of thinking carefully before cutting, the discipline of measurement, the patience to redo a thing that was almost right until it was fully right. His daughter Eleanor turned out to have an eye for wood that matched her father's. By the time she was 12, she was spending time in the workshop, first watching, then helping, then, with her father's quiet encouragement and her mother's initially raised eyebrow that gradually became acceptance, actually working. Thomas taught her as his father had taught him, with the same method of questions that led to discoveries rather than answers that replaced the need for them. She was faster than he had been at her age, and her carving was delicate and assured in a way that was entirely her own. What she might have become, what she might have built, that was a story still unfolding. His son Richard, on the other hand, was meant for something else. Richard loved the forest but not the workshop, loved the living wood but not the cut timber, and by the time he was 15 it was clear to everyone, including Thomas, that he was going to be a forester, a man who managed the woodland rather than harvesting it. Thomas accepted this without disappointment, because he understood, his father had taught him this too, though not explicitly, that the best thing you could give a child was not a trade, but a principle, that there was dignity and purpose in doing any honest work with your full attention and care, that the craftsman and the forester and the farmer and the merchant were all, at the deepest level, engaged in the same project, which was the project of maintaining the world, of keeping it going, of handing it to the next generation in at least as good a condition as they received it. The house in Ashford, which Thomas had been continuously improving and adapting since his return from the cathedral, was by his mid-40s a fine example of a prosperous craftsman's home. The main structure had been rebuilt over the years, from the original single room his parents had occupied to a proper hall house. 2 stories in one section, with a solar above the main hall where the family could sleep apart from the main living space, a proper kitchen detached from the main building to reduce the risk of fire, a covered passage connecting it to the hall, a small garden behind the house where Margaret grew herbs and where the children had grown up playing. The windows had glass in them, Not everywhere. Glass remained expensive enough that it was used selectively. But in the hall and in the solar, real crown glass set in lead cames, the slightly greenish tint of it catching the light in a way that still gave Thomas a small private pleasure every morning when he came downstairs and saw the sun coming through it. He had installed those windows himself, learning the basic technique of leading glass specifically for the purpose, because there was no local glazier and because the job was small enough that it did not make sense to bring one in from the town. If you've stayed this far, if you felt even a fragment of what Thomas felt in those long, ordinary, extraordinary days, then like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear a story about what it really means to build something with your hands and your life. Share it with someone who believes that simple work cannot carry great meaning, because Thomas's entire existence was an argument against that belief, and it is an argument worth sharing. The workshop continued. The apprentices became journeymen and went out into the world, sending back occasional news of where they had settled and what they were building. One of them, a boy from the north part of the village named Walter, eventually became master carpenter to a great lord in the north of England and sent Thomas a letter, his first written communication from a former apprentice, that Thomas kept folded in the lid of the oak chest that had been his first major commission, the chest he had made for his own house the year he and Margaret married. Edmund died in the winter that Thomas was 46. He had been declining slowly for several years, the tremor in his hand becoming more pronounced, the range of his movement gradually narrowing to the chair by the hearth and the short walk in the garden when the weather was fine. He died without event, in the same room where he had slept for 60 years, in the bed he had built himself from the oak he had selected and felled and seasoned himself, the bed that Thomas had repaired twice over the years, as joints had worked loose under the weight of decades, tightening them with the same tools his father had used to cut them. Thomas sat with him through the last night and felt, in the silence of that vigil, the full weight of what was being passed. Not the trade. The trade had been passed years ago, gradually and without ceremony, the way the best transmissions happen. Not the house or the workshop or the tools. Those were already his in every practical sense. What was being passed was something harder to name: the continuity of attention. The long line of hands that had worked this particular piece of ground, shaped these particular trees, served these particular neighbors. The knowledge that a human life, however small it might appear against the backdrop of history, was made significant not by the size of what it accomplished, but by the quality of attention it paid to the things that were actually in front of it. Thomas buried his father in the churchyard beside the church whose pews he had repaired, under a simple stone that Thomas carved himself. The tools of the trade, a square and a mallet, with Edmund's name and the dates of his life. It was the finest carving Thomas had ever done. It was also the most personal. He worked on it for 3 weeks, alone in the workshop in the evenings after everyone else had gone home, taking the same care with it that Edmund had taught him to take with everything, because the work does not know whether anyone is watching, and neither does the craftsman who does it correctly. The years after Edmund's death were the years of Thomas's full authority, not just as a craftsman but as a figure in the community, the kind of man people came to when something needed doing, or when a decision needed making, or when the collective weight of a situation required someone who had been present long enough to understand its history and patient enough to think past the immediate pressure of the moment. He served twice on the village jury for local disputes. He helped to negotiate the terms of a new arrangement between the village and the lord of the manor regarding the use of the woodland, a negotiation that drew on both his forestry knowledge, acquired through Richard, and his understanding of how buildings were made and what timber was actually worth, which the Lord Steward had systematically underestimated. He trained Eleanor in the full range of the craft, and when she was 20, she took on her first independent commission, a set of cupboards for the new inn, built to a design of her own devising, and finished to a standard that Thomas would not have improved. He watched her complete the installation with the same expression his father had worn watching him, and felt the strange, vertiginous joy of seeing something continue that you had poured yourself into, continuing not as a copy of what you had done, but as its own thing, distinct and alive. Margaret's health began to fail when Thomas was 52. It was gradual, as these things so often are, a tiredness that did not lift, a pallor that worried him even as she dismissed his concern with the practical directness that had always been her most characteristic quality. She continued to manage the household, continued to grow her herbs, continued to be the steady counterweight to Thomas's tendency to become absorbed in the workshop to the exclusion of other things. But there was a quality of effort in it now that had not been there before, a visible expenditure of will in tasks that had previously been effortless. He adapted the workshop schedule to be home more. He hired a woman from the village to help Margaret with the heavier domestic work. He brought his morning cup to drink beside her in the garden when the weather was fair, sitting in the same silence they had shared for 30 years, the comfortable silence of two people who had long since run through all the words they needed and discovered that presence was a better thing anyway. She lived to see Eleanor's wedding, to see Richard's children born, to see the workshop that her husband's hands had built become the workshop that her daughter's hands now shaped. She died in the early spring, when the first green was just appearing on the trees, in the same house, expanded, improved, beautified over decades, that Thomas had built onto for her when they were newly married. Thomas worked until the winter of his 63rd year. He worked because work was what he knew how to do, and because the alternative, not working, was not something he recognized as a state he was equipped to inhabit. But he also worked differently in those last years, with more pauses, more looking at the thing in progress before adding the next cut, more willingness to stand back and let Eleanor's hands do what his own could no longer do with the same precision. He became, in those years, what his father had been to him in the years after Edmund's collapse, the elder voice of experience, the corrector of principles, the living archive of 50 years of knowing how this particular wood in this particular region responded to this particular range of tools in the hands of craftsmen who paid attention. The last thing Thomas built was a cradle. Eleanor's second child was coming, and she had asked him for a cradle, and he had agreed with the simplicity of a man who understood that this was exactly the right kind of last project. A cradle, the most beginning thing, the piece of furniture that holds the beginning of everything. He built it from a piece of walnut he had been keeping for 20 years, a plank of exceptional figure that he had purchased from a timber merchant and never been able to find quite the right use for. Now he knew what it was for. He shaped it with care he could not have named in any technical vocabulary, a care that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with what he was putting into the wood. Not just skill, but something more, the accumulated weight of a life spent paying attention to material things as if they mattered, which they do. Which they always do, because the things we make with our hands are the most direct expression of what we believe about the world we are living in and leaving behind. The cradle was finished on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when the light was already failing and the workshop was cold with the first real cold of winter. Thomas set it on the bench and stepped back and looked at it for a long time. It rocked slightly in the draft from the open workshop door. The walnut was dark and smooth and warm in a way that wood with good figure always is, and the curved lines of the hood were exactly what he had seen in his mind when he first sat down with the timber. He called Eleanor in to see it. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "It's beautiful, Father." And he said, "Good." And that was enough. That had always been enough. Subscribe to this channel right now, because if Thomas's story moved you, if you felt even a piece of that life in your chest, there are dozens more stories like this waiting for you here. Stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary lives with nothing but their hands, their patience, and their refusal to give up. Hit subscribe and never miss one. If you watched all the way to the end, it means you are exactly the kind of person who understands what it means to build something slowly, carefully, and with your whole heart. Leave a comment saying, "I watched all the way to the end so that I can know you, so I can know who really values the stories we tell on this channel and who I am really making them for." Leave a like on this video if Thomas's life said something to you that you needed to hear today, and share it. Share it with someone who is in the middle of building something and needs to be reminded that the building is the point, that the long, ordinary days of work are not the time before the thing that matters. They are the thing that matters. They have always been the thing that matters, and they always will be. Inside the home of a medieval English carpenter, there was no magic. There was no miracle. There was only wood and tools and time and the daily decision, made again and again across 60 years, to show up and do the work and do it well. That is the whole story. That is all of it. And it is more than enough.